was asked to provide a document going through developing a performance framework. We weren't sure when you said performance framework what was meant. So based on the information that was in the letter, we assumed that we were talking about the development of a performance management framework for Parliament and not a performance framework, which can carry different meanings. So what we did was to just provide a brief overview of the development of a performance management framework. But before I go into the document, just generally speaking, it's always advisable once we are looking at how we measure performance and how an organization wants to measure performance to do this work through a consultancy. So to find a consultant that has the experience and the expertise in developing performance management systems for an organization. Sorry, that's just sort of a general guidance. And the reason for that is because we are a part of the organization, there are some things that we need to think about that get skewed because of our intimate involvement and some assumptions that we have internally that can play out in the development of the performance management system. So a third party gives us some distance for us to look really carefully at two really basic things. Why do we want a performance management system? That's the first question that we have to answer. And then the second question is, what are we measuring when we're talking about a performance management system? And the Parliament is a little unique because it has two roles, but three functions that you are looking at through the lens of performance. So there is the Member of Parliament, whose role as a parliamentarian in passing laws and attending parliamentary meetings, committee meetings. And there's also the role of the MP in his or her constituency, which is different from his role sitting in Parliament. But then you also have cabinet ministers in Parliament who have another role in the executive that also needs to be looked at through the lens of performance. And they're not the same, they're very different roles. And so how we measure performance across those three roles become a little bit more complex, especially where you may have one person doing all three functions.
So let me ask, because what you would have presented just now is a disaggregation of the roles, yes, and defining separate functions. So in terms of the Houses of Representatives, the role in terms of a legislator coming to Parliament and the activities in Parliament, then you would have set aside the role of that very same individual who would have been operating as a member of Parliament in a constituency.
I wouldn't agree when you say set aside, because even in performing their role as a legislator,
yes,
the MP has to represent his constituency in Parliament and the position of his constituents on any particular matter. But it is not the primary role when he is sitting in the chamber.
Okay. And then now the third one, where you would have had that at the executive level, that cabinet minister who plays it's not a dual role now. It would be more separate roles. And so you make the distinction. Member Robinson?
In looking at this, I'm wondering whether this really can be applied in our context. And I wanted to ask Mrs. Thompson-Walters whether this exists in any other jurisdiction, either function of the Westminster model or any other. Because I'm struggling. While I'm fully appreciative of the fact that we need to try and measure performance a lot better, I don't see how we would do it in our context, given the difficulties. So if we segregate the three roles, for example, let's take Member of Parliament as the first one. You can measure attendance at Parliament as an example, right? But attendance by itself doesn't mean anything if somebody just comes every meeting and just sits down and says nothing. As a constituency representative, you can measure, for example, whether you have done your CDF consultation, whether you have done complied with those CDF things. But the reality is that your effectiveness as a constituency representative is very dependent on access and availability of resources, which differ across each MP, whether you're on the government or the opposition side. A minister of government gets directives from the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, which I would say of the three, that's the easiest one to measure, because the Prime Minister would say, we expect X, Y, Z from this particular minister, and you can, based on budget presentations or whatever, you can see where somebody is. But I just wonder whether we can really do this in our context. And I said that as somebody who is committed to trying to improve how we are viewed, but I really struggle to see, particularly as a legislator and a constituency rep, are you going to measure how many questions I've tabled? Are you going to measure how many private member motions I've done, many of which are never answered or never debated? Are you going to measure how many times I stand up and contribute to debates on various subjects, which again is subjective? So my question would be, does this exist anywhere? And really, can this framework be applied to the context in which we operate?
So to answer your question whether or not it exists anywhere else, I would ask the committee to allow me to just do some checks and come back. Unfortunately, I got this assignment last night. However, sorry, you were going to say something?
No, I said that, so just for ease of reference, Member Robinson, it's my understanding that the Parliament would have written seeking to ascertain information from the same question you would have asked if this has been done elsewhere. Right. And that would be the...
What I can tell you is that in respect to the Cabinet, yes, there are performance management systems for cabinets. And I am sure that there are performance management systems for parliaments. I just need to go and find the evidence and to present it to you. Ministers are the easiest one because there's a policy and a set of programs that they need to lead, right, and how they lead those. However, it is not impossible to create a performance system for Parliament and for MPs. For example, and this is why one of the things that we've said is that you have to think about each role separately. Let me take the role of an MP. It would not be, or certainly I would not recommend that the performance period for the role of an MP be an annual performance assessment, because what an MP is doing in their constituency takes time. You have projects that you're carrying out in your constituency, and those take time to come to fruition. You could possibly say performance for an MP would be looked at over a period of 2 years. An MP could lay out their plan for their constituency at the beginning of 2 years in consultation with their constituents, just the things that are important to the constituency, how those things get done. And then that report could come into Parliament at the end of the 2 years and be laid on the floor of Parliament. And the persons can ask the MP questions from that report. And that would be a performance measure, the fact that you have brought this report and the substance of the report. Any performance management system must take into account any handicap that the individual is working with. So whether it be human resources, technical expertise, funding, all of those handicaps must be taken into account and can be built into any measurement system that we arrive at.
So, for example, I think we start in the state of the constituency debates today. So each MP will presumably outline what they plan to do, etc. Now, outside of the CDF, where you get a fixed allocation per year, additional funding is not guaranteed, meaning you will lobby various state agencies for particular projects. You may get, you may not get, right? Depending on which side you are on, depending on your relationship with particular ministers, etc. So you will see some members of Parliament doing lots of infrastructure projects in their constituency.
Right.
And the public views them in a very positive way. Others not, because they don't have access to the same resources. So how you measure MPs in an environment like that, where there are widely different allocations of resources, is problematic, very, very problematic. And I just don't see how you will get to a meaningful measure across the board. If you're going to measure me against resources allocated to my constituency, that might be one thing, because some people might get $1 billion a year, some people might get 50 million. So you can't measure them on the same footing. Ministers of government have some advantages in the sense that they have more access to personnel and human resources than an MP who, quite frankly, outside of your CDF officer and your constituency secretary, you have no access to human resources. So again, the ability to put together a project document, all of those things are vary widely depending on where you sit. And in a parliament like ours, a system which is very dominated by the executive, heavily dominated by the executive, since independence, that's how our parliament has been, there is definitely an advantage to those who sit in the executive. So again, the extent to which you can have a performance management system which takes into account those things, I think is going to be very challenging. Not impossible, but very challenging.
Thank you, Member Robinson. Member Holness, welcome.
Hello, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Apologies for my tardiness. I had only one question. As a matter of fact, I don't quite agree with Member Robinson on much of what he had to say, because it very often is based on who is government, how that particular administration functions, how even individuals function in the executive. So it comes down sometimes to personality and how people perform and their attitude and their tribalism. My experience has been different since 2016. As a member of parliament, I would have had far more projects in my first term than I have in my second term as an MP. But my observation in terms of how the government has functioned is one in which seats that were significantly underserved in the past becomes the priority. So it really depends on your policy priority and how efficient individuals are, and to some extent, some amount of lobbying, to some extent. I wondered, who is going to appraise us? That was my question. My big question is exactly who is going to sit down and do this performance appraisal of members of parliament? If someone can answer that question for me. It was a very basic, simple question, but in all of this job description exercise, I wondered who would be appraising us. Already our constituents appraise us. They do so at the end of a term when an election is called. So that is going to be our ultimate appraisal. But I really wondered, because this year I would have had $40 million assigned for 2 major road projects and my CDF to spend. My constituency is so large that I do not have a CDF officer. That $1.5 million, I can't afford to pay an individual. We have to do the work ourselves from the office, because that $1.5 million could go to a road, it could go towards health care, it could go to some burials, it can go to some food package, some housing assistance. And so I think I probably am one of the few of the 63 who cannot afford even a CDF officer. I'm happy you're here from the Ministry of Finance, and from other quarters, our CDF quarters, we have been asking if the CDF officer could be paid outside of the CDF. And for the ministry to also take a look, in looking at our job descriptions, at what $40 million valued in 2007 to what $20 million value in 2023, and see if we can take a look at the CDF in that critical way, so that we are better able to function if it is expected that we as members of parliament should be carrying such a significant burden.
Thank you for that, Member Holness. Member Williams.
I just wanted to make an input or contribution in relation to the issues raised by Member Robinson. Now, in my experience as a relatively new MP, what I find is that outside of the CDF, we have been given several allocations from ministers, central government, all of which are presented through Parliament. So, for example, and I think this is based on the principle of the equality of Parliament, where the Ministry of Tourism, for example, would allocate each year a certain sum for development projects that are, tourism related. But all 63 MPs get that funding. Most recently, through the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, every MP has gotten an allocation of $4 million for urban renewal. Most recently, every MP got $1 million for drain cleaning from the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, Ministry of Works. I'm outlining this not to bore you, but just to, indicate that outside of the CDF, we have been getting assistance. And I might just mention also that every MP has been given an allocation of $40 million for road improvement and road rehabilitation. So, just to name a few, through the Ministry of Labor, all 63 MPs were given an allocation to assist with short-term poverty reduction. So, in my limited experience as an MP, I can say that based on these allocations and based on this principle of equality of Parliament, we have been given assistance, all 63 MPs. Now, so I say that to say this. While I understand from Member Robinson that, there might be variations, there might be certain developmental projects, emergency projects, I don't know. There might be a criteria, and in a particular constituency, there might be a project. What I'm saying is that at least these allocations to every MP could form a basis. At least there is something there to assess how the MPs in this equal context have used up their allocations in terms of, how did their constituency benefit? You see, I'm going, remember, I'm not saying that there might be, it's probably maybe difficult to look at constituency X against constituency Y, because constituency X might have had an additional project through central government. Yes, that may have happened. But can we at least start? We can at least use the equal allocation that everybody gets each year through the various ministries and their CDF, and to see how they have used up those funds, how they have assisted and benefited their constituency. That's just my 2 cents.
My point really wasn't that we don't get allocations. That's really not the point I was making. But again, I would say, even if you take all those allocations into account, how do you assess my performance? The Ministry of Labor gives you 1.5 million for short-term poverty alleviation. You send a list of names, the person gets the checks. Can you assess, is it that you're assessing whether I have done it or I have not done it? Equally, TPDCO gives you an allocation. Do you assess it on the type of project I have done, the nature of the project? We got additional stuff for back to school, so you have beneficiaries there, which you can assess. But how do you, to me, the only way you assess that is whether I did it or not. Have I followed through and ensured that my constituents have been benefiting from what the government has provided? But again, I don't see how you can effectively assess me unless I just don't use the resources at all. Because I have used it, in my case, you do the additional back to school, you do a TPDCO project, the 40 million project. Hopefully when we implement it, you can see those things. But what is it? Is that a tick in the box to say, yes, you have done it? Is it a tick in the box to say, no, you haven't? So my struggle really is accepting everything. And again, that wasn't really the gravamen of my point, is how you effectively grade me. Do I get an A+ because I have used up all the resources the government has given me, regardless of the impact? Do I get a C because I've used 70% of the resources the government has given me? I don't know. I'm just putting it out there because I'm still struggling a bit to see how an effective performance system can be used in our context.
I still struggle to appreciate aspects of how we will be graded in terms of our performance, but it is very clear that there are many activities executed by members of parliament that can be graded. Let's go down some on our job description. Attendance to parliament. The record is there, the record is clear. So while other persons may think you are just not at parliament, you would be able to include in that documentation trips on behalf of the government, or if you've had any other reason that you had to submit because you could not be in parliament, or if you're ill. And those things would be taken into consideration. Attendance and participation at committees, also something that can be graded for parliamentarians. I would suggest to Member Robinson that CDF allocation, I have observed, even though they have not been rated, an assessment of how individual members of parliament function with their CDF. It is because of that why we have been able, along with even reviews of the Auditor General, to find some anomalies where one member of parliament is giving one person $2 million for funeral, let me use that as an example, while the average given to every other constituent is $20,000. So you see some of the anomalies and you can pull that out. Yes, sometimes we don't take them here, but some of the anomalies you see. And so even in CDF spend, you can see the efficiency. You can determine if members of parliament are giving benefits to constituents, people registered in their constituency with addresses in their constituency. So you do have mechanisms to be able to do so. You have members of parliament, when a program is executed, they take forever. So the money would have been sent to CDF and not collected. money would have been sent to SDC, but it's not spent. 6 months later, a year later, the allocation for the previous year, when the rest of us bawling for additional resources, theirs have not been completely spent. Many members of parliament do not keep their biannual CDF consultation meetings at all. So that is another mechanism to determine if you are executing in keeping with what your constituents want and desire. The training and development that comes to us as members of parliament in participating in committee meetings, chairing committee meetings, and in our private members' motion, in our contributions to debate, will all come into sharp focus in determining what your contribution is like. All right. I thought I spoke so loudly that I could keep the mic far away. So I am looking at it, and I believe there's a lot on which we can be graded. Your job is, because their rating of your performance is always going to be done based on what they thought your job should have been, not what it is. And from our first town hall, even though we have argued we are going to try to do a weekday, do it after work, where we get more persons out, it is very evident, even in talking to my constituents, that they're wondering, what are we doing? They don't need this. They know what the MP's job is, and in any event, what they want the MP's jobs to be. And that's what they are voting for you to come back in respect of what they think your job ought to be. So you will get a glowing performance appraisal on the JD and be voted out if that is not why they voted for you to be there.
Thank you. Member.
To my fellow committee members, I've been listening, and it is pretty clear to me that there are various elements to the barometer in contemplating the performance of a member of parliament, or what are the key elements of the function of members of parliament. Among them, how responsive the MP is, how many projects executed, perhaps attendance at parliament, attendance at committee meetings, and how often the MP makes a representation in the House on behalf of their constituents. I wondered, though, Mrs. Thompson-Walters, whether in your contemplation of developing a performance management framework, one, whether you considered, as Member Holness had raised the matter of who should be the opposite assessor. And I also wondered, let's presuppose you have a member of parliament who does none of the above, well, none of what I had mentioned earlier in terms of what could be considered key elements of good performance. What then would be an appropriate consequence for that clear lack of performance? Did you consider in your research, your contemplations, who should be the arbiter of what that consequence should be? And if there's no clear answer to that, or to those two questions in terms of the assessor or the determinant of the consequence, I invite you to share with us your thoughts on the utility of a process that, none of those two key elements are clear.
Sure. So if I could just take everybody back to my first two statements. When you're developing a performance management system, the two most important questions that we have to answer, and we have to answer it for ourselves. I can't give you that answer. Why should we measure performance, and what performance should we measure? That is for the organization to contemplate, and that because you have, the reason you need to think about why should you be measuring performance, what is the outcome of this performance management system for? What will it do? Most persons believe that a performance review is looking only at past performance. It is not, or it should not be. Performance management looks both backward and forward. It looks at if these, so for example, Member Robinson, you had indicated that there is some MPs are more challenged than others in finding resources, whether those be monetary, human resources, technical, just in finding resources. That comes out or ought to come out in any performance management system and needs to be taken into account when you're looking at any MP. What were the factors that would have prevented persons from achieving what they said they were going to achieve? The information that comes out from doing this on a regular basis can point to solutions for these things and bring them to light. It brings clarity to the situation that all MPs face. So it's not, I would say, and now this is from my own observation, if you're looking at a performance management system for members of parliament, the idea is not to grade a member of parliament. That should not be the outcome of this system. The outcome of the system is to say, what are the standards of performance we expect as a country for our members of parliament? That's the first thing. The second thing should be, what do we as a country need to do to help members of parliament to achieve those performance standards? The third thing that we need to look at is the constituents that are in that MP's constituency. How are they involved in the development of those plans for that constituency? Because we must always remember that an MP's first job is to their constituency. Collectively, their job is for the country of Jamaica. So we really need to get to why are we doing this? What do we expect to get out of this? It's not a grade, it's not an A, a B, a C, 100%, a 20%. That ought not to be what is driving us. In respect to the question about who is going to be doing this appraisal, as an MP, your appraiser ought to be the people that you are working for, which is your constituency. But there is an interest in the wider country as to how MPs are performing in their constituency. And so, to my mind, and again, this is just me going off of my own experience, I would need to do some additional research and so, but to my mind, in the same way we expect public bodies to come before Parliament and put in their annual report, and that report can be questioned by any citizen because it is, or it ought to be publicly available. To my mind, that is what we should be expecting out of this performance management system, which is in its infancy. It's not going to solve all our problems at once. It will grow and it will evolve. So we start off with a report from our MPs, whether it's an every 2-year report, every 3-year report, that says in my constituency, this is what I've done. Journalists, citizens, anybody, civic society, you can come, take the report, interrogate it. If you go down to my constituency with the report in your hand, you can ask constituents and give your feedback nationally. That, to me, is, if we start from there, eventually we will get to a system that is more robust, more, pointed. But for now, what we're looking at is, how do we set these standards, and then how do we help MPs to achieve these standards? This is brand new for the Parliament.
This, before you, Member Robinson, this is, out of the 3 issues that we are dealing with, this is the most intensive. And you can hear by the feedback that we are getting out of these discussions. The key question that started out is, based on the uniqueness of this activity, and we are going into frontiers that we never expected to go before, who is going to be assessing us? In the final analysis, members of Parliament have a fixed-term contract that the people are going to assess them at the expiration of that contract to determine whether or not that contract is going to be renewed. So that's your employer, the people that you serve. But we have to determine in this exercise, because Mrs. Thompson-Walters, I gather from your feedback, the consequential impact of an exercise of this nature is not to say you're going to terminate the service of an employee, but more to change behavior and to improve behavior and to set some standards to which performance has to be measured. I hear coming out of it the provision of those tools for performance. And this is where now members of parliament can get the opportunity to voice their concerns throughout an assessment period. This is what I want to improve my performance. This is how I can improve my performance. And so at the end of the day, there are some key performance indicators that are going to be set, establishing of a performance matrix. But you made mention, Mrs. Thompson-Walters, given the uniqueness of this, in a normal workplace, in a regular workplace, an assessment is done annually or biannually. But given the complexity in nature of the role of parliamentarians, were you suggesting that it be done over another extended period of 2 years?
No, I was suggesting that the role of the MP not be done annually. Remember, at the start, we looked at we're saying that the parliament is unique because it has 3 functions. The persons who are here have 3 functions, 2 roles, 3 functions. As a legislator, that's one, that can be done annually. We have a legislative calendar, and to the extent we achieve that calendar, is one of the performance metrics. As a parliament, together, that's one of the metrics for looking at the performance of the parliament. And that can be done annually. As a minister of government in the executive, there is an annual budget that you need to lead your ministry against, and that can be done annually. I am suggesting that as a member of parliament, it is a little bit more difficult to look at a member of parliament's performance annually, because you have projects that are ongoing that requires time to come to fruition. We're dealing with a wide cross-section of people within any constituency, different needs, difficulties that come up. And so if we look at and this is brand new for MPs, and if we look at that across a longer performance time, over time we can probably bring it back to a year, but my suggestion would be that we start with a longer performance timeline for MPs. But that's just my suggestion.
One very specific thing that I would recommend to the committee, and Mrs. Thompson-Walters said it, this issue of an annual report. I have voluntarily done an annual report every year for the last 12 years as MP, just based on my own volition without it being compulsory. It would be useful if there is a specific guideline set about what should be in that report. So for example, I put in my full CDF expenditure, the other funds that I get from the government, I indicate how I spend it. I indicate the parliamentary committees I sit on, etc. But I think that's one thing that I think would help in terms of how we are perceived with our constituents and help in terms of more accountability. But it would require some guidelines from the parliament to say these are critical elements that should be included, and you give somebody a template, and you can either do it by a calendar year or you can do it by the financial year, and you could tie it to the CDF in the same way you're supposed to have biennial consultations. You can say you're supposed to have biennial reports, as an example. That is a specific thing I believe we should do to assist in this process. I still struggle with how the performance evaluation will be done overall, but this is one thing that I think will help.
Welcome, Member Clark, Member Tufton. Member Holness.
That is a point on which I agree with Member Robinson. I have often seen reports by Member Robinson being called CDF reports, and I've had to, in more than one occasion, say to persons, it's not a CDF report. He is reporting on the activities in his constituency in whatever mechanism is done. I would recommend that we do have such a document prepared by members of parliament, and preferably it runs in keeping with the government's fiscal year, March or April to March, so that it is easy to reconcile, particularly with your CDF allocations, which run April to March of each year. So I believe that is a good suggestion, and it would augur well for persons to be able to do such a report on their constituency. Where I have a challenge is, again, there are no resources provided to do that. So if one is asking that members of parliament prepare these reports, some members of parliament would not have the human resource or otherwise to be able to execute preparation of these documents. And so we'd have to know that. Thank you.
You know, one of the things I am grappling with is, so who designs, who develops this performance framework system? Because we can't do it with a consultation, but my concern is developing something for ourselves designed with no level of independency, and us developing something for our own pecuniary interests. Now, you mentioned earlier about getting some type of organization to develop this. Can you expand on that?
Sure. What I was indicating is that it would certainly help things to move on a little faster, because you would have a group of persons who would be focused on just doing this, is to get a consultant in to work alongside the committee to develop the performance metrics, how it would work, what are the areas that would be looked at for performance, how we treat with limitations in resources, you know, how does that weight the scoring, if there is a scoring grid, or because it doesn't have to be a score at the end of the day, it could just be feedback. You know, what is the most appropriate way of measuring performance across the 3 roles? That was my suggestion.
Yes, member.
I would be very happy if the consultant, having been engaged, is one that appreciates the tenets that you outlined in the beginning. It is not about ABC. It is about ensuring that a critical look is taken at what is required to ensure members of parliament can perform as is expected. And hopefully one that also has the background of not just functioning in the legislature and being in parliament and parliamentary committees, but being able to dovetail the vast requirements of serving your constituents as a part of that process. I won't go further in terms of where the consultants may think that members of parliament need to be able to financially function in that regard.
They could make recommendations.
Well, I can have it in my mind where that could possibly go. But that would be part of the scope of work of any consultant, and that can be determined. Can proceed. If there's anything else you want to highlight, Mrs. Thompson-Walters?
Not particularly. The document that you have is really sort of a base document for developing any performance management system. I think the first recommendation I would give to the committee members, which is, I know is difficult, is to divorce your minds from performance management in a company or a business from what we expect out of this. It cannot be the same thing because the work here is vastly different. And one of the benefits of doing this through a consultancy is that the consultant can bring that out independently. I think that is sort of based on the document that we were asked to develop.
You know, one of the things I take away from this also, in any type of performance assessment, always give the opportunity to change behavior and to, if you are performing assumably below standard, you get an opportunity to, as you indicated in your document, up your game.
Yes.
And that is one of the key features of any performance assessment. Additionally, it gives you the opportunity to provide feedback on the needs that you may have to improve your own performance in your constituency. What are some of those fundamental key issues, key needs that you may have overall that you can say, if we get these tools, we are able to improve our performance. And so it's always, a performance assessment is always a two-way street. The feedback from the assessor and the feedback from those who are being assessed. Member Clark, Member Tufton, any comments? This has been an intriguing deliberation where those that are members of the House of Representatives or MPs can get an opportunity to provide their own feedback.
Thank you very much, sir, for singling me out. I appreciate it. No. But firstly, I want to apologize for missing the previous meeting. I think we got our wires crossed there, and I was traveling on official business, so I missed the town hall meeting, so I apologize again. I agree with you that it's a very important exercise. From my own personal experiences, I think there are some best practices that can be emulated. I think the member immediately in front of me, Member Robinson, outlined one such with the report. The issue is establishing what the specific standard protocol is. I think that would go a far way in the interest of transparency. And so I support it. I've actually always admired his capacity for finding funding to publish it in the mainstream media. As much as I admire the report itself. No, I've seen it published. But I also support Member Holness's point, which is why I made a joke about the mainstream publication, because it does require a particular skill set and energy and time to make it happen, and it costs. And members of Parliament, chairman, provide a multiplicity of functions. For those of us who have been there, we are social workers primarily, lawyers, counselors. We do everything from marriage counseling to poverty alleviation. And there is a perception that somehow we have a solution to every problem, particularly when it is resource-based, and it is so far from the truth. So even with the CDF that you get, the demands on that sometimes, it's just way out. So we would need to configure an arrangement, I think, because where there is a requirement for accountability and transparency, there's also a requirement for a bureaucracy to support it. Bureaucracy may be the wrong terminology because there's a perception around and stigma with that. So I would support that as a major role. The other thing I'd say, Chairman, since you put me on the spot, is to say that to the extent that you do a job description, you may want to ensure that there is sufficient flexibility around the role of the Member of Parliament because of the variables that may be different from one jurisdiction to another. I've always been of the view, as someone who has a large constituency both in St. Elizabeth and here in St. Catherine, when allocations are made around fixing a road and everybody gets $1 million or $2 million to fix a road. It sounds like it's equitable, but from a needs-based perspective, now I understand the problem of those who are giving the resources, the particular portfolio area, because how do you now determine through means testing or otherwise that you have more roads than me? But take Member Holness and myself on this committee and compare us with Member Williams and Member Robinson. Member Holness and myself have constituencies that are equivalent to countries in the Caribbean. And I'm not exaggerating. My constituency is as big as Barbados. And I believe Member Holness one is as big as Trinidad, probably. No.
Not to mention the topography.
No,
to Member Tufton, East Rural St. Andrew is the size of every single constituency outside of West Rural, so only one constituency is excluded. All the constituencies in Kingston are placed in East Rural, and there is space left. And yet still, we do not have resources in keeping with our geography. Thank you, Member Tufton.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that backup reinforcement there, Member Holness. Now, if you pull my colleague to my left into that mix, right? That is for Central St. James. He could literally jog around his constituency in the mornings within half an hour. And apart from the little terrain that he has, the point is, the urban and versus the rural. I just wondered whether in crafting some sort of job description, there should be sufficient flexibility, if not specifics, to kind of account for some of that. Because if you're going to assess quality of representation, sometimes there's a misalignment based on resource allocation along what is considered equitable terms, when in reality, from a practical standpoint, it's really not that equitable. Actually, it's not equitable at all. It's not equitable at all. I mean, roads alone, miles as opposed to. So that's another thing that I think I don't have the solution to, but I think we need to be bold and probably apply some objective or more objective measure on that. And then the final point I want to raise is the extent to which community engagement as part of the constituency representation is embedded in the job description. I think generally speaking, one of the problems we had, which has led, I think, to this committee, is the extent to which there is fatigue and some amount of cynicism around political representation. And if we're honest with ourselves, it's true. Our credibility is under serious question because we are judged on a particular level of being the social worker and everything for everybody. And we fall very short, not necessarily because of a lack of effort, but just a lack of resources. I think the way to restore that credibility from a job description perspective as a guide is to realign those expectations of the people versus the representative. To me, it's a very fundamental thing. And in realigning those expectations, it can be an attempt at the representative trying to justify why they can't meet those demands. It has to be a conversation around community representation and community engagement and involvement. Now, I know we have a requirement on the CDF to have a consultation, but sometimes I think some of that consultation is honored more in perception. In other words, we need to probably rethink it to see how a constituency is configured, who represents the community leaders and influencers, and see how we can interact with them in a way that makes them the purveyors of the realignment of perception versus reality, as opposed to them being the unaware onlooker who becomes the key purveyors of perception, whether on the pulpit, in the church, or in the community-based groups. And because of a lack of connection and knowledge and know what's going on and know they also contribute to some of that cynicism. And I wonder how we could reconcile that. I don't know yet, I don't have the answer to it, but for me it is almost impossible to be a minister tending to a pandemic or an outbreak or a hospital or 60 kids in a hospital down at St. Anne's Bay yesterday, and being on the ground in a constituency that is as big as Barbados to address every single issue. So you kind of need foot soldiers, and the best foot soldiers are the people who live in the community. The question is how you get that connectivity, and I think we should try and find a way to make that work. Sorry about the long-winded response, but as you asked me to give my responses. So
well, I exposed you to it, but it's good observations, and a point be told that some of the observations you made were some of the observations made by persons at the town hall meeting. Member Fitzhenley.
Yeah, I had made the point at the last meeting, Chairman, that the function of a member of Parliament in terms of what is expected by the people has evolved from what was originally contemplated in the Constitution of Jamaica. I had said that the expectation of a member of Parliament is really that of a benefactor in many instances. I wondered whether my colleagues on this committee, all of whom are elected by the people, would lend us their thoughts on whether in developing a performance management framework, whether the view is that expectation of the MP being a benefactor, being the focal point of when issues come up and assistance is needed, whether that should be embraced in what should be contemplated as part of the function, the expectations of the MP, or should it be done away with? And we say, look, that's the function of agencies. Is that something that we should embrace moving forward? Is it practical to dispense with that sort of expectation, even as we put pen and paper to what we consider to be the function, the legitimate function of a member of Parliament? I wondered what are the thoughts concerning that?
Just to respond to Member Fitzhenley, our politics has evolved, from the 60s into a perception that an MP can deliver and do all things to all people. Now, that perception is not going to change overnight, but I don't think we should institutionalize that in any job description to formally, even though it is there, to formally say, this is the expectation that an MP can do X, Y, Z. Right? We can't. We would be setting up ourselves for failure. And I would say one of the reasons we are here at this committee is because of the negative public perception of us. That perception is largely driven by unrealistic expectations, some of which some of us create because we make promises on the campaign trail, but largely driven by unrealistic expectations that people have of representatives. And when those expectations are not fulfilled, then the cynicism is almost cemented, and it has existed over many years. We don't explain limitations when we campaign, we don't. None of us do, because we want votes. But the reality is what we can realistically do within the resources that are provided to us is very different from what our constituents expect. So to answer your question specifically, no, I don't believe we should formalize that. I think we have to continue the public education. It's not going to change a significant amount of people, because at the end of the day, when any of us walk out here and go in our constituency and people ask us certain questions, they expect responses. But we can't give up on that process of indicating to people what resources we have, what we are able to do, what agencies should be doing versus what MPs do, because agencies fall down on the job. That process must continue.
Member Robinson has said a little bit of what my thoughts are. Let me see if I can dissect it. One, I agree. I don't believe that we should cement the narrative that we are benefactors. It is a perception created by opposition and government over the years, not just members of parliament on the campaign trail. When we sit in here and we talk, and even on the campaign trail, the way we speak have created a sense in people that we are dishonest, that we are corrupt, that we are thieves, and we are comfortable with it, not understanding that over time, it is a nasty paint painting all of us. In my constituency, and I hope it continues to be successful, I was an MP that campaigned saying, no, I have limited resources. This is how government works. I've spent the last 7 years explaining to my constituents, this is how government works. And it works. The people are not stupid. They actually understand, and if we would have enough in terms of public education and support from each other, it means that that is a message that would transcend Jamaica very, very quickly. So for roads, I explain why it's one division now instead of another. I explain in terms of length of the road. I explain where we're going to get grant funding from. Explain. Many councillors do not appreciate when I explain the resources that councillors get, because they do not want anyone to know that they actually have substantial resources as well, particularly in Kingston and St. Andrew. And so they're very upset with me, and I say to them, don't be upset. Your allocation is $10.5 million approximately at the KCMC for the year. Yes, and this member of parliament knows it. My allocation for CDF is $20 million for the year. It means that you can do a lot more, even if you're not having the additional push from help you get through central government. What it requires is that you spend time educating your division on how government works, what the resources are for, what it can do, what it cannot do. So if all of us take on that responsibility, it would augur very well for us in terms of the perception of our performance as members of parliament right across Jamaica. I would say that definitively. For the persons who continue to push and believe that our role should be one that is even documented in a job description and held to a type of performance, what they want of us is never going to be what people vote for, because the culture is so cemented from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s into the 20s that we are going to have a serious challenge. I believe all of us, if we're not careful, would have passed away before the perception of the public change. And if we dare go out there for a minute, no matter what is on this written job description, and tell anyone that our job is not to see to all their needs, then they are going to say our job is not to have you there because we do not understand what purpose you serve. And we are going to have a serious balancing act because we face one reality, the people are holding us firmly to that, and it is going to take a long time, and it is going to take all of us speaking from the same Bible to get persons to that point. So I have had to explain to constituents over and over, there's no cash coming out of the pocket to distribute for social housing, and if you need to get married. And one person who is not even from my constituency who said, I must just have a heart. I said, well, I have a heart. I just don't have anything in my pocket to give you for your wedding. It is critical for us to spend the time so persons understand why they have to fill out a needs assessment form, which they never did before. When people hiss their teeth and say, why should I wait 2 to 3 weeks before I can get help for the debt benefit? Or why should I wait 2 to 3 weeks before I get the check to go to the pharmacy for my medication? Why should I wait so long? When persons argue, why is it I can only get $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 towards fixing my house? You think $50,000 can fix a house? And so all of us are faced with a perception that is far different for some in civil society in terms of what they see as the role of a member of parliament, and especially in constituencies that are either rural or in the urban centers where you have extreme poverty and the need is great, their requirement of what an MP is, a member of parliament is like from here to the next planet in terms of the difference in what they expect of us. And so for the few in civil society, even though they may not want to hear it, these job descriptions will suit them very nicely when we are done. Many members of parliament, if we can get the help from the consultants to be able to facilitate us performing at a better rate, we are going to be happy for that. But we are fooling ourselves, Member Fitzhenley, if we believe for a minute that anyone in our various constituencies at a substantial level and what impacts our vote and what gets us back in parliament cares at all about what we perceive our job is versus what they think.
Member Clark, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I did not want to speak, but you have asked me, and I am going to go ahead and do so. I want to agree with all that has been said by my colleagues, because they too understand the pain that we have going out there, or being out there. The precedent has been set long before us, and so the people are expecting certain things of us. And as Madam Holness rightly, Member Holness rightly spoke of the situation, there's no two-way about it, Mr. Chairman. But one of the things that I want my colleagues to understand, that in Jamaica you have two different areas geographically, and that is the rural and the urban. And for my fellow colleague, Minister Tufton, who sits in a rural seat, they are a lot more independent than they have somewhere to farm. In my seat, or Member Williams or Member Robinson seat, there's nowhere to farm. And so they are more heavily dependent on us as Member of Parliament. And so the question posed by Member Fitzhenley is real, but how to address it is, I think, has to be addressed on an individual basis. Not to say that you're agreeing or you are disagreeing. It is right there in your face, and you have to find means and way how to deal with it.
Let me add one other thing. You don't only have the difference in rural versus urban constituencies. There are some constituencies that have a substantial population of middle and upper class residents and very few people below the poverty line. And then there are other constituencies that have 99.999% of the people below the poverty line. And so that is another dichotomy in terms of how do you look at performance when resources are equitably allocated on an equal basis.
We have Member Williams and Member Tufton. Go ahead, Member Williams.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. You know, I've listened to Member Tufton and Member Clark in relation to the dichotomy between, rural, urban constituencies. And I've also taken note of their reference to roads and the differences between some urban and rural constituencies. No, when I listened, last year I made a presentation in Parliament, my constituency debate. And when I listened to the members here today, they are really echoing, if they should refer to my presentation. I specifically raised that point in my presentation, that the principle of the equality of Parliament does not always achieve equity across constituencies. And why I say that? They made mention a while ago that, I don't really have the kind of road problem that they have, and I have to concede, yes, that they have really, a road problem, hills and valleys, hundreds of meters of roads. However, if you look at the physical infrastructure of a central Kingston, for example, you would realize that housing and physical infrastructure is one of the major problems down there. So whereas, so this principle where you give each person, let's say for example, $10 million for a road. Each constituency equally gets $10 million for a road. Yes, Member Tufton's constituency, that is East St. Catherine, West Central St. Catherine, might need 100 million. I might not need that, but I will need $100 million for housing. It's where I'm going at. I might need $100 million for sewage, because sewage is bursting all over central Kingston. I have a major sewage problem. We're always having overflow and spills. So perhaps perhaps the time has come, Member Robinson, for us to look carefully and examine that equality principle and say whether it has achieved what it is supposed to achieve, or should we now be looking at constituencies based on their peculiar circumstances? And that would also, in my view, aid this whole performance approach, because if you have this disparity between the needs of the constituency, yet you're being allocated the same resources, you will always be stuck in a problem. You will always have a problem and you'll be stuck. So, I don't know if that's the reason why I haven't yet gotten any of my roads under my 40 million program. I don't know if it's because of the utterances that, Central Kingston don't really have a road problem. I'll ask you guys to desist. Well, they put you and I in the same category, so that is why we probably don't have our roads as yet. But I will say today that perhaps the time has come for us to really, really examine this principle of the equality of Parliament, to see to what extent, how best it has served us, and whether now constituencies need to be looked at and assessed based on their peculiar circumstances and allocated accordingly. Allocation be made accordingly. May so please, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Member Tufton.
Right, so Mr. Chair, I just want to reassure my colleagues and friends on this committee that my intention is not to divide and rule. That's an ancient concept that has no place at this committee. But I'm articulating a principle, and the principle that I articulated would apply to the member also, because he's correct that he does have issues that are very different and that equally requires resources. So it's not an attempt at saying we should get it and he shouldn't. The question is what he should get it for and what we should get it for, which raises a more fundamental principle in my mind of the concept of a development plan for a constituency. So when we campaign as members of Parliament, we campaign on a promise, and that promise equates to hope, and depending on how hopeful people are, this is the assumption anyway, they make a decision as to who can best realize their hope, and they vote accordingly for the most part. That commitment which political parties advocate in a manifesto should be drilled down, I think, into a constituency plan. you don't have to call it a constituency manifesto. You could call it a constituency development plan, which is what the CDF was intended for. And then maybe a requirement of assessment should be a kind of more fleshing out of that concept that requires not just the black and white writing down of what you plan to do, because you can create all sorts of plans. You could create a utopia, which is what creates the disconnect and undermines the credibility of the representative and the process. That plan may require, as a necessity, consultation, not just with the people on the ground, but with the technical people, so agencies of the state. So if you want to do something in regards to sewage, you may need to have as a necessity, a discussion with the people who are in charge of that kind of infrastructure. In this case, it would be NWC, right? And see what the possibilities are around a technical assessment, how long that will take, because we know we have a time-bound issue. Implementation deficit is a real issue for us. You spoke about your $40 billion is a problem, because you have the money now, you can't spend it. That is not that you don't want to spend it, but you're waiting on a process, and that process goes on forever, and the people should kind of know that too, because you use your head there, you're on the chopping block, pretty much. But so when you actually, so maybe you could do something like you advocate a manifesto statement with specifics. You campaign on that basis at the constituency level. You have a year in a 5-year term, although it's on average 4, to concretize that manifesto into a development plan. You probably are provided with some resources to do it. Does not necessarily, not just financial, personnel to flesh it out. So you may need a research assistant, whatever, project officer, which we have or should have. But you are required to produce that. That to me is a good measurement of your efforts, because you at least put effort into that plan. That plan requires consultation. And then now you assess allocations against that plan. Because in fairness to the representative, if he has a plan on sewage, and that plan has a 100 million price tag, and he only got 10 million, then you have a basis to say, well, I never get what was required based on the figures advanced by the technocrats. So it brings into the conversation a level of objectivity, which then can be the basis of performance evaluation and reconciliation. And I think that to me is the principle on which it should be. The final point I want to make, Mr. Chairman, is, so I think that should be cemented, and I think that is a reasonable expectation of every constituency representative to have a plan, but they should be allowed the time and the resources to put that plan together in a technical way beyond just articulating a vision, and that is measurable and so on. The second point is there is a lot of effort that is going to be required to realign expectations around what an MP does. Member Holness and all the others have spoken about it, because there is a totally different view by the populace, and it is in our interest to do that. It's part of our credibility restoration and the process, the restored credibility process. My advice would be that outside of trying to list what an MP, the expectations are, there should also be a second list of what an MP is not. And the communication around that should be deliberate and calculating and carried not just by the MP, but by the system and by the community. An MP is not a lot of things. And there is a perception that an MP is everything and must be everything to everybody. And there's sometimes we cause it on ourselves, that's true, because we create the hope, and sometimes the hope is well beyond what is reasonable to expect on an implementation schedule. But I think that a communications program around a job description is an opportunity to realign expectations so that the public looks at an MP, whether they are JLP or PNP, when they're seeking office, to say, okay, there is no difference between the green and the orange in terms of what they are not. So whether you decide to go with one or the other, don't expect them to do these things because they are not these things. And hopefully start a process of realigning that expectation. Now, what that does, it helps the representation and the quality of the representation, and it narrows the focus on how you audit for success or implementation. But it also, I think, places greater focus on the supporting agencies, the supporting stakeholders. Because a lot of times when MPs fail, they don't fail for a lack of representation, and failure being measured in terms of what the people expect. So the road to be fixed, the sewage, whatever. They don't fail for a lack of representation. They fail for a lack of responsiveness and support by those who are primarily responsible for implementing. Now that may be the case because they don't have the money, or they just have different priorities, but people need to know how government works. So the point I'm making, again, sorry to be long-winded, is that in the context of the definition of a member of parliament, should be the definition of a member of parliament in a wider ecosystem of how he functions in relation to the supporting arms of the state. Because I can't solve crime as an MP. I can lobby for crime-fighting measures in my area, that is. I can't solve the sewage problem. By the way, remember, I have a sewage problem in my constituency, as rural as I think it is. Cherry Gardens, to be exact. We're a private development, abandoned the sewage system, and ever so often it runs on the street. Nobody's through. Not the Cherry Gardens up in the, no, I don't represent the affluent community. That's Minister Chuck. I'm talking about another one in West Central St. Catherine. So the point is that I think we also have to have a preface to the job description to say what an MP, the context in which an MP operates. They are one spoke in a hub of how government works. Their primary role is to lobby, is to articulate a vision, produce a plan, and to lobby for representation for these plans to be implemented. And they depend on, and they can't do this, but they can do that. So the public gets a much clearer vision. And sometimes the way to get a clear vision is to say what they are not, what we are not just what we are. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Member Tufton. Final point, Member Fitzhenley, we have some housekeeping to do before we close.
Quickly, Mr. Chairman, I think a very useful comment made by Member Tufton in terms of the need to alert the public concerning what a member of parliament is not or should not be expected to do. And beyond the fiduciary matters or matters touching and concerning resources, another expectation that has often been proffered on members of parliament is that of being consoler-in-chief. For example, I can recall a former MP saying he regrets not attending funerals because members of his constituents expect that. So I think another useful consideration for us is whether in charting the course forward concerning what is to be expected of members of parliament or how we assess their performance, we have to contemplate whether we codify this expectation of being a consoler-in-chief. Is that part of the list of elements that should be considered as we engage this barometer in assessing the performance of an MP, or do we make it clear and include that in what Minister Tufton suggested, what Member Tufton suggested, that, you know, really that belongs in the list of what should not be expected of a member of parliament?
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson-Walters, your presence here this morning would have invited and evoked certain critical discussion, paving the way forward. I think we would have satisfied at least one critical rule in that if you are developing a performance management framework, you ought to have some consultation with those who are going to be assessed or appraised. And so we'd have had the opportunity for members of parliament to offload on you this morning the various recommendations, the various suggestions, defining the complex nature of this exercise and the diversity as it relates to, the members of parliament. You might all have the same job, but certainly not the same work. And so that was evoked this morning. Member Holness.
On behalf of the members, because some of the members expressed how valuable your contribution was to us this morning, and we just wanted to say so before you depart. Mrs. Thompson-Walters, thank you very much. We actually did not quite expect that we would have had this intervention, and we appreciate your contribution to the discourse. Very, very meaningful, and ultimately will be valuable in the exercise in coming to job descriptions for ministers and MPs. Thank you.
All right. So in terms of the outstanding matters, we have to schedule and arrange the next town hall meeting. Well, the recommendation is to set dates for the next, for all of them. I think it's 3 more. Yes.
So coming out of the last town hall meeting, we looked at doing 2 more town halls. One would be in Montego Bay, and the other would be on the other side of the island, somewhere in Clarendon, St. Elizabeth, that end, so that we allow as many persons to cover the counties of Jamaica in respect of our discussions with them. The idea was also to do it a weekday, so persons coming home from work or even students being at school would have been able to pop in after school. They're not yet picked up, and others coming from work would be able to come in and partake in the town hall session. And then the final session would be here in the Parliament, just to have all the various stakeholders who would like to visit, who would like to be a part of the process to do that final town hall, which yes. All the town hall sessions would be hybrid. I believe that's a good way to go. The first town hall probably didn't have 50 people coming to the room, but 280 odd persons were online, and they continued to watch and submitted comments long after the town hall was finished. So the concept of being able to have it taped and aired and have persons being able to ask their questions and contribute during the town hall is critical. So I love the hybrid option. It actually just opens up a world of possibility for individuals. And we may find ourselves coming back to saying, okay, based on what happens with the next one, do we do any further adjustments with the one to come in Clarendon? But we would like to finalize here and have the various stakeholders coming back. You may well be invited back to that last town hall. That would be wonderful. No, because sometimes it is good to get the insight outside of from us as parliamentarians. When chairman asks the question, so how comes we are assessing ourselves? It is good to have that perspective from someone like yourself who would have looked at the job description, look at what it really requires, and someone who is not a member of parliament speaking to the appreciation of the role, which actually helps civil society and our constituents. So that would be the culmination of the town halls, and then hopefully we would move into this Joint Select Committee finalizing the JDs and making our recommendation and report coming out of the committee.
You want to propose a date and a place, area for the next one?
You don't have to turn off your mic, Chair. So the next town hall, Marlene Malahoo Fort recommended that she would have assisted in St. James at the community college or civic center. She more preferred the community college for some reason, maybe because the students would have been coming home from school, would have been out on the day in question. So the community college was the preferred choice. Now, in terms of when, I am not happy with the turnout we had of members of the committee at the last session. And so I do not want to recommend a time for members. I think we should round robin, put some dates on email, send all of those dates out, and have persons say when we are most available. Because I would want us, even if we do not have a lot of people coming to the town hall and they're online, we should have a strong representation of the members of the Joint Select, and we should encourage parliamentarians, MPs not on the committee, senators not on the committee, to all be present. We would have more than 70 of us in that town hall if we support our own efforts as a parliament of engaging the public in being a part of the process in the discourse of what our job should entail. So I think the best option, instead of spending time trying to finalize the dates, give a slow of dates, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and so persons in the committee could by email finalize.
So what we could do, member holders, is to look at the activities in Parliament and the schedules in Parliament and look at those dates that are more feasible. We circulate them and have round robin and have members, respond accordingly. Yeah. Next thing we want to do, we have some submissions. We have 3 submissions, one from a Mr. O'Shane Duval Wright, one from a Miss Jennifer Rose, and one from the National Integrity Action. So we'd want to invite these respondents, if possible, to meet. Well, I don't know if they want to come. One has indicated, yeah?
I would recommend, for efficiency's sake, going forward, that we don't necessarily invite really submissions to every session. I believe the town hall held here in the Parliament is an excellent opportunity for those individuals to come to that final town hall and make their presentations in summary to that session. So I think as members, we should spend the time to read and critique ourselves and see what are the contributions being made here that we would like to take on, and come forward with our own recommendation of what we would like to take on coming out of these submissions. It would also be good for us to plan in the timetable a meeting of the committee only, so that we are sort of assessing, just as we have done today, what happened at the previous town hall, what the submissions are like, and make determinations as it relates to our next step, instead of just forging ahead, having the town halls, and then at the final one, everything comes down on us. So at least a meeting needs to be had before that final town hall, and then as we expect, after the final town hall, we would be meeting anyways. Again.
Yes.
I'm reading the NIA submission, and is it that haven't we received the code of conduct, and he's requesting that the code of conduct drafted by Minister Malahou Fort be shared. Wasn't something shared with us before? I'm asking, I'm not sure. I know in my package I saw something here, which is a green paper, and
so what we would have in our package is a green paper from 2002 that guides cabinet.
No, well, I saw this June 2023, job descriptions. Oh, that's a separate document? It's separate from what he's asking?
You spoke of the code of conduct.
Oh, all right. Well, can we have it then? I wasn't sure whether it was provided to us. If not, then should we request that?
All right. Date of the next meeting. Date of the next meeting is October 17th and 31st.
The date of this next meeting?
Yes.
But should we meet so soon before we... I don't think we should meet so soon.
I'm of the view that we should first put the town hall and round robin those. Once we've selected the dates for the town halls, then we can decide where we now meet in between those town hall sessions.
Okay. So we were going by initially some dates were being proposed for us.
No, we locked some dates, so
yes.
we already have some dates
Right.
locked. But those dates were locked for 10 o'clock for our purposes initially.
Right.
We have not yet locked any dates for town hall meetings, and coming out of the first town hall, which was a Sunday afternoon, and we believe not well attended because people stayed home, they weren't on the road, they decided not to get up and come out. We are now suggesting that we look at some evenings, whether it be Wednesday evening, Thursday evening, Friday evening, whenever it is, but an evening in the week. So those would be what we would round robin first. And coming out of those, then we could decide, okay, we don't need to have another meeting before the next town hall in St. James, but we'd like to have one before Clarendon,
right.
depending on what comes out of the one for St. James. And if we don't need to have a meeting before Clarendon, then that's fine, just the same. We continue to the next town hall, but we would absolutely need to be back before we do that final town hall in the parliamentary setting so that we have the benefit of all we have learned, gleaned, all the submissions coming into that final town hall. And after that town hall, then it is just up to the committee to meet.
Good. So I believe we have a plan. Colleagues, thank you very much today. I believe we have had a very engaging discussion, and we look forward to the next series of meetings. Motion for adjournment. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.